it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Marilyn Robinson is an American novelist and essayist. She is the author of 5 novels and several works of nonfiction. Her novel Gilead won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2005. Ms. Robinson received the National Humanities Medal from President Obama in 2012 and the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction in 2016, when Time magazine placed her on its list of 100 most influential people. Robinson began teaching at the Iowa's Writers' Workshop in 1991 and retired in the spring of 2016. Jack is Robinson's 4th novel in her now classic series. In it, Robinson tells the story of John Ames Boughton, the prodigal son of Gilead's Presbyterian minister. The novel tells the story of Jack's romance with Della, a high school teacher who is also the child of a preacher. Their interracial romance speaks to all the paradoxes of American life then and now. We are thrilled to have Marilyn in conversation with R.L. Kwan. R.L. Kwan is a South Korean-born American author. In 2018, she published her best-selling debut novel, The Incendiaries. Thank you again for joining us on PNP Live, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to our amazing authors.
Hi everyone, I'm so excited to be here with you all and thrilled beyond belief to be here with Marilyn Robinson. She's going to read for us first from the absolutely wonderful Jack, and then we'll have a short Q&A, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll go through as many as we can. And yeah, thank you all for being here.
Do I begin?
Yes, if you want to.
I'm going to read from a portion of the novel where Jack, he's been mistaken for a minister by Della, the daughter of a minister who is, who invites him in for tea and talks with him and so on this sort of genteel assumption that, that it's an appropriate thing to do. He falls madly in love with her, but he realizes that he has deceived her simply by wearing a black suit, which he had bought to wear to a funeral of his mother that he will not attend. So he decides that he has to drop the pretense and so on. So he has, well, anyway, we'll take up from here. He helped her out of a rainstorm with an umbrella that he had stolen from a park bench. He had thought of forgetting the umbrella as a pretext for stopping by again, but she handed it to him. He would have to think of another ruse before he got rid of that suit. He knew better. He would not be leaving books on her step with notes in them, brief but very clever, that would make her think of him for a minute or two every now and then. On one hand, if he did, it would give him a pleasant thing to be thinking about, working out the little messages in his mind for weeks perhaps, and finding the right books to steal. On the other hand, people do that sort of thing when they imagine something might come of it. She couldn't be seen walking down the street with him without damage to her reputation, a risk a teacher can't take. The same would not be true for him, since he hardly had a reputation properly so-called. His old compulsion to do damage as chance offered had seen to that. If anything remained to him that might be called a good name, walking down the street with her would put an end to it. He felt the warm chill of impulse, actually frightening himself a little with the thought that he could do harm so easily, so innocently, really, except in the fact that he knew how grave and final the harm would be to her. A shudder of guilt passed through him, stirring other guilt, of course. There he was on a park bench in the morning sun among the squawk and gabble and the church bells, to his inner eye naked as Adam to his own scrutiny. Stay away from her, fool. That's simple enough. So the next day he went to the store, or whatever it was, where he had bought the dark suit, a room with harsh window light and festoons of flypaper, and tables heaped with discards. and he traded it with his hat and umbrella for another hat and a double-breasted brown tweed suit with the impersonal smell of cigarette smoke already infused in it, and a small stain on the left lapel. He changed in a back room and emerged more or less himself. It was a relief to put all his pretensions down on the counter. The trade was not to his advantage, except in the sense that he had hoped to find something cheap and a little raffish. Fair warning, he thought. And he was somehow relieved that he was no longer wearing a black suit with brown shoes. The man at the counter said, "I always have things in here that would fit you. Widows bring them in." Very funny. He would not let his mood be dampened. He bought a newspaper and a pack of cigarettes at a dark little shop crowded with pipe racks and souvenir humidors and ashtrays and cans of tobacco and cigars that smelled something like tar and licorice. Somewhere in it all was a radio blaring a baseball game. The little man at the cash register watched him intently, as if theft were a card trick and he was going to catch him at this time. The effect of the suit, he thought, since he was pretty sure he'd never been in that particular shop before. He startled the fellow with a dollar bill, slipped the change into his pocket, and went out into the street. The baseball game was close. It was the 8th inning. So he leaned against the wall in the sun to listen and folded the paper to the crossword puzzle. He pushed his hat back on his head, hung a smoke from his lip, and worked the puzzle, thinking that if anyone noticed him, he would seem to be playing the horses. Clothes do make the man. He glanced up because he was thinking. 6 letters, the second one D, and there was Della, a flinch. That look in her eyes, surprise, realization, maybe even rebuke. She was with another young woman. It seemed to him she paused for some part of a second, long enough that the other woman glanced at him, a little mystified at the almost nothing that had passed between them. And then they went on, arm in arm, heads together, laughing, not at him or about him, dear Jesus. This was misery enough to justify a drink, a binge, in fact. But for some reason, he just spent most of the night lying on his bed, feeling an elemental loneliness pour into his bones, that coldness that inheres in things left to themselves. When the heart rests from its labors, for example, that excruciating push of blood. What had happened was just what he had intended, but he had not thought it would catch him off guard like that. All in one instant, without a word to say for himself, though what that word might have been, he couldn't imagine. He had done her no harm at all. One lie that was more her fault than his. No, it wasn't. She had repaid kindness with kindness, as she would not have done if she'd known who he was, what he was. When defects of character are your character, you become a what? He had noticed this. No one ever says, a liar is who you are, or who you are is a thief. He was a what? Absolutely. He put on one suit of clothes. A fraud is what he was. He put on another suit of clothes. A bum, a grifter. A draft dodger was what he was. Even that was a lie. His name was a lie, no matter who had dampened his brow with it. All his manners and the words he used and the immutable habits of his mind. Sweet Jesus, there was no bottom to it. Nothing he could say about himself, finally. He was acquainted with despair. The thought made him laugh. He had to admit that he found it interesting, which was a mercy, and which made it something less than despair, bad as it was. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. Much of the time, this was his favorite poem.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. It's such a joy to hear you read from this book. Maybe I'll start by saying that, so I know it's not an uncommon feeling to consider it for, I know so many people who think of you as one of their favorite writers, one of their favorite novelists, and I am in that company. And part of it for me is that I grew up wanting to be a pastor, and I only didn't follow through because I left the faith. And I remember reading Gilead when I was just about to start graduate school. And it was a two-part revelation. And the first part of it was, why on earth am I going to try to write? Why on earth am I going to try to be a novelist if Gilead already exists? Should I just give up, not go to graduate school, do something else with my life? But then after that, the second part of the revelation for me was, what could be a better way to spend my life than in trying to do something, than in trying to work magic in somewhere in the same field as what this book just did for me, somewhere in the same universe as what this book did for me. The book was and is a balm, and for me it's one of the first and still only times I've found company in books for what felt and still feels like a profound loneliness, the loneliness of apostasy. And Jack, this novel's central character, and the reprobate of the Gilead world, is possibly the closest I've felt to any character in contemporary fiction, maybe fiction period. I'm just not sure I've loved one any more than I love Jack. And so I found it fascinating that in an interview with the Paris Review 12 years ago, you were asked if you had thought of telling home one of your other Gilead novels from Jack's point of view. And you said, I found this to be so moving. You said, I would lose Jack if I tried to get too close to him as a narrator. He's alienated in a complicated way. Other people don't find him comprehensible, and he doesn't find them comprehensible. And I'm so glad and thankful that you ended up writing a novel from his point of view after all. And I wonder if you could talk about what changed.
Well, first of all, your story about why should I write? I used to feel that every time I read a major writer. When I was in college, I can remember being plunged into despair by William Faulkner, plunged into despair by Hamlin Garland. Why write? And I think that has to be a major impulse toward writing. The fact that you really have to have a strong impulse to do it, over against your own love of what's already accomplished in the genre. Glad you survived. I didn't feel that I could. I did not want to conventionalize Jack, because that runs against the absolute definition of who he is. I did not want to find one explanation in his childhood or something else that would seem to have led to subsequent, eccentricities, because that would be, again, to undervalue him as an individual. I put it aside as a problem, but very often that doesn't mean that my mind has actually put it aside. Things tend to germinate without my necessarily asking that they should. And so it just came to me at a certain point that I did know how to deal with Jack. And it would be, of course, by having him be the voice, because being seen from the outside, he would not be understood in an appropriate way. So it's just a matter of my finally feeling that I knew what his voice would sound like, what he would say.
And do you, along those lines, it's just been incredible with each of your last three novels, with Home, Lila, and Jack, to learn more and more about these characters we first encountered in Gilead. There's a nearly miraculous coherence to these books, and I just wonder if did you know all of this, everything that's in these books? Did you know this while you were writing Gilead, or did it develop over time?
I think, writers tend to say, I don't know what I think till I see what I say, And I always felt as if from Gilead, I always felt as if the sort of marginal characters were known to me in a much richer way than Gilead could support, as a single novel. But that's the same feeling that I also had when I wrote Housekeeping. And then I made the decision not to continue with that place or those people. And I was very sorry to give them up. And this time I thought, maybe if these people are so alive to me, why not give them their books, because they were alive to me in the same way that John Ames was, Um, so, I mean, they grow up in the structure basically that's created by the initial fiction. But at the same time, they do feel very strongly individuated to me. And so, it just seemed like a kind of I don't know, satisfying thing to do.
And so satisfying for your admirers and readers too.
Thank you.
Really, I was telling Ellen, our agent, that that this was maybe the only that there was going to be from the point of view of Jack, and this has been such a gift.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Well, you said, and I'm in awe of this. You said that you so that Gilead came to you because you heard. Well, that part of how Gilead came to you is that you heard John's voice in your ear talking. And similarly, you've said that you overheard Jack and Della talking as they're walking together at the start of Jack. And character or characters talking, and then that's how the book takes on a life.
Well, in a general way, that is true, except that I can't really describe the experience of knowing the voices. I mean, it's not like an oral hallucination or something like that. It's just like it's probably the closest analogy, where you store voices in your mind, and somebody would say that this is your brother David speaking. You'd say, no, you're not. This is an imposter. I know his voice. It has that same feeling in a way, and that same kind of. It's very hard to describe, but the voices tell me when I have lost the voices. If I use language that would not be their language, or if I, have some sort of edge in the voice that would not be there, whatever. Then I have to correct that. There's a sense in which my feeling about the voice preexists my writing the voice.
And is that part of so another part of what I love so much about your work is that in Jack, as in all your novels, I don't think I've ever come across a single sentence that rang false or felt forced or in any way untrue to who the characters seem to be to me. And in this week's New Yorker profile, you said that you consider a day a success if you've perfected a single sentence. And you said, I feel that everything has to be structurally integral, and that if I write even one sentence that does not feel right, it's a flawed structure. And I actually, when I read that, I started crying with the sense of fellowship, because this is one of my central guiding principles in writing fiction. And it's something that is a great delight to me, but also a great source of bedevilment. And
Perfect word.
And I wonder, is there more you could say about how you know a sentence is right, how you know you've perfected it? Or is that also something that is sort of that is not useful to describe?
I would say it's not. It's not. I think it's fair to use the analogy of music. I often do, as a matter of fact, come to think of it. But it seems to me as if people have what might be called a music. The pitch and the tempo and all these things that are very highly particular to specific people. And so, if you're listening to a melody and then there's the wrong note is in it, you hear the wrong note, and you can't, it's kind of like that. I don't know. I think maybe I can't describe it.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. and you listen to music while you write. I think I've read. And is there, I'm actually very curious about, do you listen to one song at a time? Do you listen to an album? Do you listen to a genre of music? Does it, does it change per character? Does it?
No, but it's never less than an album, you know. And frankly, I mean, I think it said in the New Yorker that I listened to Bessie Smith while I was writing Housekeeping, and Billie Holiday also. And I think it's the way that the cadences of language interweave the music, you know, so that they sort of mutually interpret, you know. Because there's so much, I think people get a little deaf to language because we're so saturated with it all the time. But basically, language is music. And in this sort of vernacular songs, you know, they draw out the fact that, you know, the music is a large part of the meaning of language, the way we hear it, feel it.
Yes, absolutely. All right. With each answer you give, I feel as though there are 10 more questions I want to ask, and I'm trying to focus on the one on the one that feels right for you and for this event. Well, let's see. So for 14 years, ever since I first read Gilead, I've read, I think, every piece of writing of yours that I've at least been able to come across, every essay, every interview, and I couldn't find the exact interview, but I believe I have a memory of having read that you don't necessarily revise a lot, and so I'm curious about that, given how wonderful your sentences are and how wonderful your books are. Do you tend to work sentence by sentence? Do you skip around, or am I just remembering this incorrectly and you do revise a lot and I made this up?
No, you were right, absolutely right. I think I revise remarkably little, you know. I mean, one sentence in 100 maybe, or something like that, even to the extent that I do that. I'm absolutely serious about the need to get every sentence right before you proceed to the next sentence, you know. And that can, I mean, when I'm happy to have written a good sentence in a day, it's because I've been thinking it over and over again in my mind, you know. So and there's a way in which my revisions all occur before I write anything on the page, you know. And again, it's that strange way that you begin thinking that no, that's wrong, but that's right, you know, and that, you know, making those choices. I don't revise. I mean, I really, my books are pretty much exactly as I wrote them, you know.
Mm-hmm. That's extraordinary. I'm really just, I'm bowled over by that.
Well, you know, people find all sorts of different ways to write, you know, that just happens to be mine.
One of the most moving encounters for me and Jack, and granted, there are so many moving encounters in Jack. For me, it came when Jack meets someone who tells him almost right after having met him, "You look to me like you could use a little forgiving." And you look to me, you could use a little forgiving. And Jack the book is full of such moments of forgiveness, of generosity, of one person recognizing another as a fellow human worthy of grace. I reread that part right after last night's truly terrible, truly terrifying presidential debates. And once I cried, this time with something like joy. I cried to come across what felt like the exact opposite of the anger and the hatred I felt in my body toward people after those debates. Not all people, but some people. And Jack, like all of your novels, is radiant with just like suffused with this kind of grace. And I wonder, and this might be too tall of a question, or too big of a question, but I wonder if you have any thoughts or help for those of us who feel very close to no longer being able to see some of our fellow humans as being worthy of grace, as meriting grace and forgiveness. for what they've done?
Well, I at some point in my life, I decided that as a religious person, I could not imagine how God could not love anyone that I or anyone else could love. The only possible assumption is that God is more loving than any of us, and therefore, is more munificent in His love than any of us can imagine. And then I thought, as a sort of the other side of that is that since being loved is so important to human beings and very worthy people never enjoy it, you have to assume that God would love whomever no one else loved. And this, it's this sort of, my family call it sort of triangulation, seeing a situation as God sees it. You encounter someone, and you find him offensive in whatever way you do, maybe even threatening. And then you think, how is he perceived by God? And it has to be something vastly more compassionate and knowing than anything that you would ever be capable of, And that our obligation to other people as images of God is to try to understand that that's what they are, no matter what the complications and uglinesses and so on of life that obscure our perception of them. I guess I'm a universalist. It's, I think that's probably a good beginning place. And then if it needs to be narrowed down, that's up to God. I'm not going to even go there,
Well, I feel as though I should, I have so many more questions for you, but I feel as though to be fair to our wonderful audience and our very large audience, I should move on to audience questions. And so let's see, there's a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, you have said that Melville was an immense influence on you and you've taught Moby Dick many times. Side note, I am so sad I never got to sit on any of your classes on Moby Dick, the Old Testament. I've heard from so many friends who learned from you that your classes were just like mind-blowingly incredible, and this is one of the great sorrows of my life that I never got to sit in on these classes. So the questioner says, I wonder whether you have published any writing on Moby Dick or plan to. Yeah, so that's the question.
I've thought about it. Everything that my mind lingers over for 5 minutes, I think I've thought of writing about, and I really would like to write about, Father Maple's sermon and then the conclusion of the novel, a theological interpretation of these things, but I might not get to that because it's a long list, the things that I would like to write about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's a question from, let's see, Jacqueline Wu, and Jacqueline asks, what was your inspiration for the character of Jack? Was he based on anyone, or did he more sort of spring fully realized to mind? I guess you sort of addressed that, but I don't know if there's more you want to say about that.
Not really. I don't know where my characters come from.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that I'm sort of nest building out of fragments of experience here and there, but I can't say that any of them is identical with anyone I have known or known of.
I actually have a follow-up question to that. Well, no, actually, I'll stick to audience questions because they're just keeping. I think they're just keeping more of them. People have a lot of questions for you. Let's see. Lavinia Mitchell says, thank you so much for writing another book in this series. The best thing about 2020! Exclamation mark. The question is, I'm interested in your writing process. What does a typical day look like?
Well, I'm pretty kind of inconstant about my writing. A lot of time I spend actually reading. I don't write unless if I have the impetus of something that's very much on my mind. But I don't write simply to write. I only write as a way of serving another interest. You know, I mean, for example, exploring a character or something like that. I mean, I know a lot of writers, very good writers, who get up at a certain hour in the morning and put in a certain number of hours and so on. And they're good writers, it works for them. But I'm not like that. I just, a long time can pass between one piece of writing and the next.
I have a follow-up question to that. Do you, because you also, of course, read a great deal of nonfiction, and I wonder if, do you ever feel torn between the two, or do they feel complementary? Do they just exist separately? Yeah.
Yes, they're complementary. There are things that, you know, I mean, the whole narrative of Gilead, the first book, comes out of historical reading that I did, primary text and so on, about the settlement of Iowa. And then noting the drift, noting the difference between where it had arrived and where it began, which is a story of decline, I'm afraid. And so for this country in many ways. But anyway, I was interested in it as history, but it came to me in my mind as being the narrative of the people who had lived through these generations that are so idealistic and egalitarian in the first place, and then drift away and become forgetful of this very valuable heritage that they should enjoy, they should perpetuate. And so the fiction very much rises out of the history, and Jack should, I mean, in terms of the legality of life in Iowa that was established before it became a state, even before the Civil War, he should have been able to have brought his family to Gilead and to have lived in peace and happiness, comfort in Gilead, because there were no laws against interracial marriage or any of these other things that were going on in other places. But the fact that there were no laws did not mean that other norms were not culturally enforced, which they certainly were. And that's the tragedy, for the country. If we had just not talked ourselves out of our best ideas, we would be in a much better place.
It was so moving to, after the first time I read Jack, I went back and read Gilead, and it was even more heartbreaking and even more moving, that ending that you have for Jack and Della at the end of Gilead, which I know gets has a different turn later on in Home, but no, it's such a terrible thing, keeping them apart, such a terrible, ridiculous thing that is making Jack's life so hard with Della.
It's terrible and ridiculous. That's exactly it.
When that, of course, resonates in every possible way with Black Lives Matter and with the white supremacy firmly on display last night. Well,
we didn't have an astounding example of white people who should be predominating, but I mean, he's not an advertisement for the race, is he?
I was thinking president instead. I know your vocation is clearly to write, but I think you're a better president.
I think probably 50% of the population would make a better president.
Okay, let's see. Jody Franklin asks, how do you write such perfect sentences? Lyrical, natural, every word carrying so much weight without the reader feeling an authorial presence.
Practice. No, it's all done in the mind, it's all, does that feel right? Does that sound right? No, it doesn't. Yes, it does, What is the music of this character? Is this faithful to that standard? But not even that at that level of consciousness, Just the thing about, I mean, language is just beautiful. It really is. It's the most amazing human accomplishment, probably, And and incredibly flexible. Endlessly new variations are possible on language after all these millennia. It was just amazing. And I think that if you are very aware of language as being a living thing, you know, a collective art that everyone can modify in some degree and does, you know, that it's, you know, I think one of the things that can make language flatten is when people think of it as utilitarian, you know, rather than something beautiful in itself. You know, it's like the difference between plodding and dancing or something like that. You know, when you know, you're doing the same thing in both cases, but the aesthetic life of language before you do anything with it is real and enormously to be, you know, enjoyed and exploited, and you know.
I remember reading once that, or a painter, I'm blanking on who, a painter was asked, why did you become a painter? And this painter said, you know, I just really love paint. Like, I love touching it. I love painting it. I love the textures. And that rang a bell for me. I was like, I just love words. Words are so incredible. The English language is one of the best, spend so much time with it every day.
Exactly.
Let's see. Maria Tucha, and I apologize if I mispronounce this, Maria. Maria asks, how long have you been intrigued by the role of preacher slash pastor slash pastor's child?
Well, I wasn't particularly aware of being intrigued by them. I've read theology and so on for many years, you know. So I have been a member of the same church for a very long time, and perhaps less than I was aware of, I was watching the culture and the, you know, minister in a congregation. It's a beautiful little special culture, special. Understanding that it's quite natural with one thing and another that it would be John Ames who first introduced himself to me, and then since Jack shares my obsessions in a remarkable degree, it's not entirely surprising that he seeks them out also.
Yeah, there's that exchange between Jack and John in Gilead, when Jack asks, the part when Jack asks, does it seem right to you that there should be no common language between us, that there should be no way to bring a drop of water to those of us who languish in the flames or who will? And Jack, of course, is asking about how far he feels from salvation and from God's presence, while his entire family feels so close to it or lives inside of it. And that's a passage I go back to over and over and over again as one of the central questions of my life. Do you a follow-up question to what you were saying? I know you are a deacon at your church, and that you sometimes preached, or I think still preach, and give sermons. And in the New Yorker profile, I read that that now those are on Vimeo. I don't even know how to pronounce that, but now they're over a screen. And just out of like personal curiosity, and I don't know if this is intrusive, and if not, then forget it. Can other people listen to you preach? Is that now an option in this new wild world we're in during this pandemic?
Well, no, I haven't I haven't been a deacon for many years. I was, and then in my church, people get rotated out of their clerical offices, so I was I aged out or something. I don't know. Um, I enjoyed it, but it was a passing pleasure. I don't preach very much at all. I used to sometimes because for some reason it would be useful to the minister or whatever that he had a substitute, and I'm interested in writing sermons, but I'm very unhappy in pulpits. I just feel like the biggest imposter in the world. So there is a collection of sermons that I gave years ago that somebody in the church actually has. I don't have it. I haven't looked at them. But I don't, one of the things that I like about clergy, I think, is the little distance that I feel from them. They are clergy and I am not,
Wait, I caught on the fact that there's a collection of your sermons somewhere out there in the world. Is that something that you would ever consider putting out in the world? Could FSG publish that as your next book, or is that not something you've ever entertained?
Be a slender book, I'll tell you that. I don't know. I'd have to look at them again. I haven't looked at them. I don't know. I think they're rather essayistic, and can't surprise you.
I would give so much to be able to read those, but
well, maybe I'll do something with them,
For now, I'll just imagine them. Let's see. Jody Franklin asks, Jody asks, given that you don't revise much on a sentence level, have you determined the full plot before you start sentence one? Is it fully formed at the start, or does the plot come to you as you go?
The plot comes as there are things like, for example, I know that Lila has to marry John Ames. There are certain things that are built in that are necessary. But for her, since those things are established, the other thing that needs to be established, which utterly is primary, is the character herself or himself in Jack's case, it's one thing to say John Ames marries this agricultural worker drifter type, and another to create one that you believe and know that he loves, that loves him, vice versa. You have to, from my point of view, the whole credibility, the whole point of both Lila and Jack is creating the character. Plot is the secondary, very secondary thing.
I also have so much trouble thinking about plot. I think I almost don't like the word very much.
I don't either.
Wait, the acoustics of it.
You are so right about plot.
Plot, like it's not a word I want to spend much time on in my head.
Exactly.
Let's see. Rich Lowe asks, Marilyn, are there books or writers you recommend if Rich wants to dip their toe into interpreting the Old Testament?
Interesting. This is me. There's a lot of writing, quasi-scholarly writing about the Old Testament that's just awful, in my opinion. And there's a style of Old Testament criticism that goes clear back into the middle of the 19th century that is just awful. And it's had a huge impact of, the documentary hypothesis and so on. A lot of what I have done in studying the Old Testament is, of course, to create an alternative in my mind, another way of understanding it that is not reductionist in the way that theory is. So I'm always braced against some dominant literature. And I think Gerhard von Rad, the old German theologian, is pretty good, you know. I mean, is good. I don't know him thoroughly, though. It's a tendency of mine. I do things like, for example, I look at the Jewish Publication Society translations and notes and so on. And then I look at the arguments made that do not take into account this kind of understanding of Hebrew or of ancient Hebrew culture. And this opens up a lot of, a lot of space for reconsideration. It's a complicated thing that I have not yet written out. It's spent too long in my head, I'm afraid, but I will do it because I think that a lot of bad ideas have the sort of potency of what should I say, ideology or something. They've been very destructive. And then, if they were good ideas and destructive, I could, take a little comfort. But they're bad ideas. They're very bad scholarship. And so that's not a very useful answer, I'm afraid, but here we are.
No, you've done more. I think you've definitely done more to open up and change my understanding of Calvinism than anyone or anything I've read. It's fascinating to me how Calvinism has been construed and how you've construed it, and I love your take on Calvinism, and I often don't love, I think, others' takes on Calvinism.
No, they don't encourage love. They don't. It's, he's a Renaissance humanist. He's a French humanist. He wanted to write about, Seneca. He's a profound scholar. He's a very compassionate man. A lot of the misreading of him comes from the fact that he uses, classical modes of rhetoric that people don't understand anymore. But I don't know, I'm suddenly getting emails, but he also created a very humane social reforms and enlightened views of women and public education and all kinds of things that were rare in his time. And he also, with the unfortunate exception of one man, he banned capital punishment on religious grounds. Michael Servetus was unfortunately not the beneficiary of this. But by the standards of the time, which, the whole engulfing world was the Inquisition at that time, he was a huge step toward humane enlightenment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that, I feel as though that comes through so strongly in your novels. And yeah, well, let's see. There's a question from Charlotte Gadu, and again, Charlotte, I apologize if I mispronounced your name. Charlotte asks, do you feel more comfortable with or close to certain characters' voices than others?
Whether I feel close to them depends on how much attention I've given them, really. I mean, it's as if potentially I could spend more time with another character and then develop the kind of affinity and affection that I feel for more thoroughly developed characters.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I'm so sorry to everyone. I know there's still so many questions. Well, I'll ask one more, and then I know Politics and Prose wanted to come back on to ask Marilyn some questions. So let's see. Somebody asks, an anonymous person asks, who or what authors do you read for inspiration? What?
Oh, it kind of varies. I mean, the people that are absolutely essential to me are Emily Dickinson, Wallace Stevens, Walt Whitman. They really developed the basis, the origin of my impulses toward writing and thought. So, I mean, there are many fine writers, but if I want to restore my spirit, I tend to go to those people who are so brave, so large, so unique.
Hmm. And I'll say that your work does that for me. Reading these, I realize I'm gonna go through and just reread all your novels again. I think it's going to really help me through this next month of trouble and misery.
Well, you have my heartfelt best wishes. I certainly hope they have that effect.
Thank you so much. And I'll turn this over to Politics and Prose.
Great.
Hi, Marilyn. So like I said, huge fan. I have so many questions that I had to short list my questions to the most relevant ones, even though I'll send you a letter. You can respond if you'd like. No pressure. It's only been my whole life I've been waiting for this moment. I was curious though, where Jack ended, was a curious place for it to end for me, especially after reading Gilead. And I was just wondering why you chose that spot, especially since we knew like what was going to happen in the future.
Well, you know, it just seems to me as if the sort of perfect metaphor for the kind of living in one society, but living in two societies, in fact, and in experience, you know, with this sort of uncrossable line between them. The idea that they're traveling to the same place, to a place that for both of them have a kind of an association of home because their lives together began there and so on. And at the same time, there's this, they can't acknowledge that they're actually together. And, you know, I mean, it seemed like the right ending to me at the time.
Interesting. Okay. And then I was also curious because I don't know when you started working on Jack, but I was wondering how the progressed for you in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, the momentum for racial justice. Did your relationship to the characters Jack and Della change with time, or did you feel the same towards them as you wrote?
Well, of course, the book was pretty much in hand before the Black Lives Movement began, you know. But the fact is that this bizarre relationship there is between the two major constitutive races of North America, you know, that this strange duet that has gone on for centuries and centuries, you know, very much to the disadvantage of, you know, to the disadvantage of the Black side, except it has to be said that despite everything, despite every obstacle, they did many brilliant things, as they continue to do, you know. But this was always, I mean, sometimes we're aware of it and sometimes we're not. But these bizarre social structures that, you know, that existed before the Civil War and then existed under Jim Crow and so on, they have an incredible tenacity in the culture, you know? And so I might seem to have written in advance of a recent manifestation of all this, but in fact, it's simply because knowing the history, I know that this is something that is consistent through time, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it seemed just so brilliant, so perfectly Marilyn Robinson in its timing. I was like, okay, I just have to ask. And then my next question's twofold, because yeah, like I said, I was a religion major, and I basically carried Gilead around my backpack with me all the time. And in my biggest moments of despair, I'd actually reference the Bible passages that you referenced in Gilead. And I was wondering which passages of the Bible I've read, but I wasn't sure if they had changed. What passage of the Bible do you go back to for strength and hope? And also, and this is also a question for you, what brings you hope in these times of chaos and darkness?
Well, you know, I'm very much on my mind, of course, is the parable of the Great Judgment in 25th chapter of Matthew. The idea of Christ's identification with the poorest, and, you know, the sort of inversion of felt reality that comes from the fact that, you know, the insistence that the sympathy and identity of God is implanted at the deepest levels of human culture, that, you know, the least valued, as I think it says 1,000 things, you know. As far as hope is concerned, you know, I mean, I think that we are supposed to understand, Christian people are supposed to understand that everything is ultimately in God's hands, you know, and that, I mean, we know that human beings suffer. That's part of that, just, you know, a theological problem for anyone, but it's also true that we can't expect to be exempt from that. And if we've heard 1,000 times about that, you know, the loyalty of God to the poor, we should not fear poverty to the extent that we do. At the same time that we ought not to permit poverty to the extent that we do. I mean, both of these things are simultaneous. But I mean, I've had a very, very privileged life, and I'm aware of that. I'm also aware from reading history that human beings go through rough times. And, you know, we have a lot to keep. We have a lot to lose. If we, you know, we could be the generations that abandoned the project of human equality, you know. We never lived up to it, but I don't think it has any other comparable champions to the best that we have had, have been. I mean, you know, we have to remember that we have been very fortunate that whatever happens, our resources remain incredibly large. And I'm speaking of human resources, ability and goodwill and good intent. And we have to be brave. I mean, our hope is in our courage. Absolutely.
Thank you. Reese, what about you?
Well, I don't know that I have much to add to that, but I mean, literature for sure, poetry, Marilyn's books, always poetry do continue to give me hope. It just makes me so happy that humans are so intent on and fascinated by beauty, and that we do so much and that we devote our lives to finding and creating beauty. I find that to be intensely moving and something that always restores my faith in humans. And but also I will say, because it is true that these days I'm lower on hope than I've been in a very long time. And when I feel like this, I'm more interested in hope as a verb and in hope as an action. I'm interested in acting like a person with hope. Currently, it is important to me to be as politically engaged as though I were a machine running on hope. And there's something really beautiful and strange for me in that if I act like a person with hope, then the hope tends to follow. The feeling tends to follow action. And I found that to be a relatively reliable sort of help in times of difficulty, in times of crisis.
Thank you both. Marilyn, I have one more question. I can't go without asking you this, even though my dad will kill me because he told me not to ask. But I was just wondering, do you have a favorite character that you've written, or are they all kind of your darlings in different ways?
They're all my darlings. They are. It's a funny thing. Sometimes I look at, you know, somebody says, well, such and such is her finest book. And then I feel like saying, well, what about, I don't, you know, an invidious statement about one book, even in the most charitable comparison with another book, makes me sympathize with the apparently lesser book and so on. I mean, you know, I'm a mother hen, you know, I'm loyal to them all.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure. Well, I want to thank you both again. Thank you so much to Marilyn Robinson and Aro Kwan for being here, and to you, our amazing audience. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this, and I cannot stress this enough, we cannot continue to host these events without the book sales to support them. So if you could please support Marilyn Robinson and Politics and Prose by using the link in the chat to purchase Jack, that would be amazing. And for more PNP live events, check our website for updated event listings. It's going to be a really exciting fall. And again, I want to give a final round of thanks to Marilyn Robinson and Naro Kwan. This is an absolute dream. Thank you all for joining us today. And from all of us at Politics and Prose, stay safe, stay strong, and stay well read. We'll see you next time.